I began reading the book Incognito by David Eagleman over the Christmas break this past year, 2015. Like I always do, I try to extract an idea that means something to me personally and for my funnest hobby, developing new ideas. The idea that stuck with me from my reading was the narrative about language. David used the concept that we all know, being able to read, to describe something about the brain. He was using the skill of reading to illustrate the point that we don't consciously think about the details or the mechanics of reading. We don't hear the brain crunching the details of making letters arranged into chunks and sequences on the page make sense as ideas. To make his point, he had printed some passages from different languages on the page. One in ancient Sumerian, one in Chinese, and one in Arabic. Now, to the average reader, of course, these arrangements of symbols make no sense. But to the folks who have learned these languages, they would have made perfect sense. This information David was presenting along with some interesting stories about people who have literally learned to see using things like electrodes placed on their tongues. The point David was trying to make is that the brain is fully capable of taking input and learning to make sense of it. With enough practice, one can literally learn to see with the tongue. At 3 a.m. one morning over vacation, I was pondering this narrative from the book and simply thinking about what it meant to me. And my brain went immediately to the complex circuitry that's involved in reading a paragraph from a book. David is absolutely right. We don't think about the details of the letters, how they're arranged, and the sequences of those letters or chunks of letters, words as we've come to know them, that have come to have meaning in our brains. Our brains do that all by themselves. The part that David didn't elaborate on, but which my brain went directly to, was the fact that any one of us could learn a new language if we spent enough time and enough effort doing it. Just like a blind man, we can learn to decipher sequences of electrical impulses and see with the tongue, and so any of us could learn how to decipher words and letters from a different language and make them into meaning, and then be able to read and write the new language. Now, many people are obviously interested in doing this for one reason or another. Hence the proliferation of programs like the Rosetta Stone, which are now advertised incessantly on TV. Now, I'm not particularly interested in learning a new language right at the moment, mostly because I know how much time it would take to do that, months, perhaps years. And most people that I deal with in my practice are not interested in learning a new language per se either. But what they are interested in is learning to do something different, like, say, for instance, to eat healthy and to eat lean. Now, what most people haven't considered is how similar learning new eating or exercising habits is to learning a new language. Just as we have learned to effortlessly skim the page and make meaning out of the narrative, so we have learned to put little or no conscious thought into the complex array of mental algorithms that govern food selection and the consumption of food process. I want you to consider these two following sentences. Sentence number 1. The way we learn to read is the same as learning to eat. Here's sentence number 2. La forma en que aprendemos a leer es lo mismo que aprender a comer. They mean the same thing, one in English, the other in Spanish. Now, to those who know Spanish, I apologize if Google Translator butchered the translation. And I apologize even more for my lame attempt at speaking it. But they're literally the same. The words consist of combinations of the same letters, the ones I know in English and the ones in Spanish, but the arrangement and the meaning of the chunks of letters, that is, the words, means nothing to me in the second one. My conscious brain knows that it's Spanish because I looked it up, and now my conscious brain knows exactly what it means, but my subconscious brain does not. And until my subconscious brain knows the underpinnings of all of the letter arrangements, the spelling, the grammar, etc., I won't truly know the language. Just because I, for the moment, may now be able to tell you what this sentence means in Spanish, I hope you can appreciate the fact that I'm no closer to knowing fluent Spanish than I was before Googling this phrase in the handy online translator. Now, I could spend a few minutes memorizing sentence number 2 and learn what it means, but would that be the same thing as knowing the language? Of course not. Yet, this is what many people think is the ticket to losing weight. Memorizing a few phrases, that is, diets, facts about nutrition, maybe online helpers like MyFitnessPal, and then expecting to somehow speak the language of lean. It just isn't going to happen that way. It almost seems too obvious when we frame it up as learning a new language, doesn't it? But in reality, it's the same thing. This is such a critical aspect of what I bring to the table. If we're going to win the battle of the bulge, we have to learn the language of lean. And it is every bit as tedious as learning a new language. If we're going to learn to speak a new language, what we really are doing is committing to the rules of the new language and then committing those to our subconscious, which means literally hours and hours of repetition. Think about it for a moment. In the above example, the idea of to learn in English is synonymous with the word aprender in Spanish. The only way that aprender is ever going to mean to learn in my brain is to repeat the word, write the word, say the word, and hear the word enough times and in the correct context for my brain to then have two choices for the concept. One in English, to learn, one in Spanish, aprender. I now know, and you now know, temporarily at least, that the word aprender means to learn. But how long before I really know it? Enough to effectively interchange the two while I'm deciding what words to choose in the moment to communicate in Spanish. Now let's shift this idea, this language idea, to languages that I have learned regarding food consumption growing up in my home, which I affectionately refer to as the language of large. My thoughts, my ideas, my rules about food intake growing up transferred to large, as in being fat, overweight, bordering on obese. And it wasn't just my family. It was the culture. Day-to-day servings that were too large. Kinds of food that were too large in calories. No limits. Celebration of eating too large of amounts of food. Fast food, restaurants, commercials, all too large. So over the years, this became my native tongue when it came to food consumption. And for a lot of years, I got away with it because I was a hardcore athlete and burned double or triple what I did once my life became more sedentary. Then the language of large took me to depressing largeness, topping out at about 80 pounds overweight. Now, I tried all of the usual methods for taking care of the problem. Countless fad diets, Atkins, South Beach, Paleo, Weight Watchers, and even Nutrisystems. What I didn't know at the time, but I know now, is that trying such is really the equivalent of learning a few vocabulary words and phrases from a new language and hoping to speak it fluently. Literally, this is how silly such approaches really are. And this is really my message to anyone who wants to live the rest of their lives eating lean and living healthy. It is literally equivalent to learning a new language fluently. So fluently that you can easily choose the correct words and phrases to convey the meaning of lean without stopping to think about it. That's how well the language of lean has to be known in the brain, burned into the subconscious right alongside the language of large. To really do this thing, that's what has to happen. And if you think I'm just using this as a metaphor, guess again. There's nothing metaphorical at all about it. This process is learning a new language. It's synonymous. Now, what occurred to me at 3 a.m. that morning is, in the beautiful calm and the silence of the night, is that I am actually bilingual when it comes to these two languages. I speak both of them quite fluently. I'm very good at the language of large, my mother tongue, and the language of lean, my more recently acquired language. In my brain, they're separate. The language of large is still easier for me to speak, but I'm quite fluent in the language of lean now as well. I'm like a translator who can keep both languages straight in my brain. I know when I'm speaking each, and I know how to make sense of each. I can now freely choose between the language of lean and the language of large. I must constantly practice the language of lean because I live in the land of large. Nearly everyone around me speaks large. TV, restaurants, parties, etc. I still speak the language of large on a few days a week, but on the other days, 5 at least, I speak the language of lean. I have found the perfect balance between these two languages that allows me to maintain my desired weight. The combination and ratios of when and where I speak each of these languages makes for a great balance between large and lean. A well-conditioned and apportioned body that has been my desired weight range for at least 15 years. I don't imagine that I will ever lose the ability to speak the language of large in my brain, nor do I even want to. I'm perfectly fine with being bilingual in this area. And quite frankly, it's the best I believe anyone can ever hope for. That is, if their mother tongue, like mine, was the language of large. I truthfully wouldn't ever want to lose the ability to enjoy speaking this language of large every now and again. I thoroughly enjoy sitting on my couch, watching football, and enjoying way too many calories from popcorn, peanuts, seafood, chowder, cheese, crackers, Christmas candy, and plenty of beer to wash it all down. That, my friends, is truly living large for brief, isolated, predetermined periods of time. I consider it one of the simple pleasures of life. Now, what occurred to me was kind of a revelation of sorts. I have often referred to what I do as being just like learning a new language. The part that was a new twist for me was this idea that I'm truly bilingual when it comes to these two languages. I do speak both languages, and both of them quite fluently. This was a bit different than the paradigm that I've somehow swapped one language out for the other. Nope, that just isn't true. I speak both, and I speak both of them very well. Also on the agenda for my thinking during that evening was the idea that so much of what we know about something is housed in the subconscious. That's something else David Eagleman was talking about. Whether it is a language that we speak or a language that controls another important aspect of our lives, how we consume food. What I've come to know is that it is in the brain that both of these languages exist, or more literally, sets of rules or instructions that have meaning and produce thought, emotion, and ultimately behavior. If we're going to learn a different way of doing something, whether it be speaking a foreign language or interacting with food in a new way, they are both going to take considerable time and effort. Just like the introduction of a new language, new ideas mean totally gibberish to the brain at first. The word apprender, to me, means absolutely nothing out of context. But when I put it side by side with the words to learn, then it has some momentary meaning to me. Think about it. How many times do you think I would have to repeat the word apprender in some sort of a meaningful context for it to register in my brain as the linguistic equivalent of to learn in the English? In that English to Spanish translation part of my brain that I might now be trying to build. And how many other ideas would I have to load into this part of my brain to speak fluent Spanish and be able to effectively translate from one to the other language? We're talking lots of repetitions, hundreds of thousands of words and meanings to get anywhere close, right? But the human brain can do it. Of course it can. As amazing of a feat as this is, people do it all the time. But, and here's the key, they understand from the outset the kind of tedious repetition that's going to have to take place to make it all happen. Now let's step back a moment and apply this to learning the language of lean. Let me take one little vocabulary pair that one might have to learn. Let's start with an easy one. When should I conclude that I'm done eating for a meal or a snack? Now, in the language of large, the answer to that question is most likely when I feel full. In the language of lean, however, the answer to that question might be when I've consumed the amount of fuel I need to sustain my body at my desired body fat percentage. Now, one is very familiar to us, the other probably very foreign to most, like the word apprender is to me. Now, here's the point I really want to drive straight home. If I'm going to learn to speak the language of Spanish, I'm going to have to somehow repeat the word apprender enough times that I can ultimately interchange either apprender or to learn freely in my mind. That will probably be thousands of repetitions, and not just for that word, but for thousands of additional words. In exactly the same way, if I'm going to speak the language of lean, I'm going to have to repeat the phrase, when I've consumed the amount of fuel I need to sustain my body at my desired body fat percentage, as a substitute for when I am full, thousands of times. And do the same thing with hundreds, perhaps thousands of additional substitutions. So how is that actually accomplished in the world of learning new language? Well, hours of repetition, literally. Any sort of new language learning program involves listening and then speaking back the desired words and phrases while thinking about the new meaning, and this process is repeated over and over again for months, perhaps years. Well, guess what? Learning the language of lean is no different. If we're truly going to speak this new language fluently, listening to and repeating the phrases over and over again is the only way to do it. The language of lean is simply the complete collection of thoughts and ideas that govern the lean person's interaction with food. How do lean people think about food? What thoughts and ideas govern the selection and quantity of food in the lean person? What thoughts govern when to eat, when to start, when to stop? If you speak the language of large, those lean thoughts and ideas are foreign to your brain, just as apprender is to mine. And until you go through the same process as you would to learn Spanish, it will remain that way. To me, thinking that a program like Weight Watchers is going to help you learn the language of lean is as silly and as frustrating as thinking that having an English to Spanish translation app on your phone gives you the ability to speak both languages and translate well enough to communicate effectively. Crazy. Having an app like that on my phone does not mean that I can now speak Spanish, let alone translate. Those skills only come with months and years of practice and repetition, learning the language. Well, my friends, here's the real point to all of this. If you really want to learn the language of lean, speak it fluently, and be able to translate from one language to the other, you're going to have to be willing to do this same thing. Listen to and repeat the language of lean in the correct context over and over until you have it driven deep into the subconscious, just like you would have done with the language of large if it's your mother tongue. Now, looking back on my own journey, it's taken me many years to speak both fluently and to be able to translate back and forth and to decide which language to use in which situations and to master this thing we call lean, which is now my desired physique. And since I live in the land of large, I still need to practice my vocabulary and my sentence comprehension routinely to remain fluent in the language of lean. It would be no different for learning Spanish, correct? How fluent would I remain without constant practice if I'm living here in America? Not very, I'm afraid. I tell you these things because I want you to understand the gravity of what you're trying to accomplish when you're trying to lose weight. Imagine for a moment that you walked into my office and announced that you were interested in learning to speak Spanish fluently enough that you could translate. And imagine that I then responded by showing you how to download and use an English to Spanish translation app on your phone, then sent you out the door with the idea that somehow having this app was going to get you to the point of being fluent and able to translate. I'd be a quack, and you would never return. Or, if you were dumb enough to think that that could be the answer, then you might go home, download the app, begin trying to use it, and soon become very disappointed. Or maybe you might even conclude that you just cannot do it, right? To me, this would be the equivalent of turning you on to the MyFitnessPal app, or the Weight Watchers app, or the Lose It app, and then suggesting that these should work to get you where you want to be. The two are no different in my book. It's no wonder to me that so many people remain overweight, disappointed, frustrated, and convinced they just cannot do it. That's where I'm different. I don't care much about diets or apps. I'm all about teaching the language of lean. And this language doesn't come in just one size fits all. There are many different dialects to choose from, depending on your particular dialect of large. The strategy that I teach for managing food consumption, CAVP, is precisely this: building a customized language of lean that directly fits your personal, individual dialect of your language of large. For reasons beyond the scope of this dissertation, it is imperative that the newly constructed language of lean be built from one's own personal, unique version of the language of large, your own dialect. While there are similarities across all dialects of both lean and large, custom building the dialect means that we're streamlining the process to target only the ideas and thoughts that are relevant to you individually. Again, just like a language, it would be kind of silly to learn all of the dialects if you're only going to be speaking one of them, right? All of this rhetoric stirred from waking up in the middle of the night and, rather than fighting to go back to sleep, simply relaxing into an idea that had been marinating in my head since I read this passage in David Eagleman's book. In the wee hours of the morning, I came to realize that I have not learned the language of lean to the exclusion of the language of large, nor do I want to. I want to only be very fluent at the language of lean and be able to speak both. The language of lean is now my primary language. the one I use at least 80% of the time. It is not my mother tongue, nor will it ever be, since I was not brought up learning it. But since I now know both of them fluently, I'm quite capable of choosing which language I use on which days and in which situations to optimize my existence, my health, and my physique. It is as advantageous, actually much more so in my book, than being able to be bilingual in English and Spanish while traveling to a foreign country like Mexico. I have the ability to use either language at my disposal whenever I deem appropriate to accomplish my goal of maintaining my current physique. But here's the part that may not be so easy to hear. It's taken me years to learn to speak it fluently and to translate like I can today. And I still must practice my non-native language consistently to remain fluent. After all, the language of lean is not the mother tongue of the Western world. The native language of America is still the language of large. So why am I putting it all out there this way? Simple. I believe that everyone has the right to know what they're up against. It's clear to me that diet programs simply don't work. And it's clear to me exactly why they don't work. They are the virtual equivalent of attempting to use a translation app to become fluent in a foreign language, and then only pulling up that app when I'm attempting to communicate. Kind of crazy, huh? So if you're contemplating the idea of losing a little weight in the new year, or are attempting to carry out a New Year's resolution, I encourage you to do so with the proper reverence for what you're trying to accomplish. Treat it as it truly is, the daunting task of learning an entirely new language. And if you want to learn more, check out the weight loss series of videos on my website. And until we meet again, adios, amigo.